My name is Christine Wilson. I'm the Director of Research and Policy Insight at the British Council, one of the members and co-founders of ICRRRA. And it's my real pleasure to welcome you all here today for our event. Now, I would say just at the start, I would apologise. I have a bit of a cold at the moment, and my voice is rather flimsy, I would say. So you'll probably be all best pleased to know that I shall be a fairly quiet chair of today's talk. But I think that will be fine, because not only do we have an excellent speaker today, but I know all of you will have a lot to say and a lot to share, and I look forward to hearing from you. So just so we get into today's talk with a shared sense of where we are, our keynote speaker today, Oby Ezekwesili, will be talking about recovering together, a pathway to a new and inclusive multilateral system. And I think this is something that has been on the minds of many of us in the course of the last year, 18 months, and probably before that. The notion of togetherness, the notion of multilateralism feels more fragmented, more under attack perhaps than for a long time. The notion of what Bruno Latour calls a new affinity for borders seems to be running throughout the world, and where nation states often are retreating behind borders, and even within states, populations retreating behind borders. And although there has been some very welcome cooperation, I think, at various levels over the course of the global pandemic, we've also seen massive fragmentation and a lack of willingness to cooperate and to share, even in the face of some of the great global challenges that we have ahead of us. COP26, as many of you know, is just around the corner, just down the road from me, of my adopted home city of Edinburgh. And in Glasgow, there is both, I think, the sense of huge optimism for the fact that countries are still willing to come together to talk, but huge pessimism, I think, whether that talk will actually be translated into action. And I know that all of us as cultural relations practitioners are very interested in hearing what our particular sphere of interest in terms of research and practice would have to address that, and to bring forward genuinely transformative and genuinely participatory systems to make positive change. And it's on that note, I would like to welcome today's keynote speaker, Dr. Oby Ezekwesili, who is the founder and chair of SPPG, the School of Politics, Policy and Governance, established by the Fiscal Policy initiative. She is the president of Human Capital Africa and currently runs the Africa Economic Development Policy Initiative. She is a former vice president of the World Bank Africa region and formerly a Minister of Education and of Mineral Resources in Nigeria. She is co-convener of the campaign I'm sure many of you will be aware of, #BringBackOurGirls, a group of citizens advocating for the speedy and effective search and rescue of the schoolgirls abducted from Chibok in 2014. She was one of the co-founders of the transformative initiative Transparency International and one of the pioneer directors of its global board in Berlin in the late 1990s. And she has also run as a presidential candidate in her home country of Nigeria. So we're delighted and privileged to have you with us. And I hand the floor now to you, Dr. Ezekwesili.
Thank you so very much, Madam Chair. And I wish you very quick recovery. It's that time of the year, right, when all kinds of allergies emerge. So I am very delighted to be a part of this year's event of the ICRRA. I had the opportunity of being with you, I think, during the period that I was in Berlin, Germany, undertaking the research into what has led to the founding of the School of Politics, Policy and Governance that our chair referred to in the introductions. Thank you for your great introductions of me. I decided that it was necessary to think of what could be a new way of recovery post-COVID, different from the ways that we've done in the past. I mean, we earlier in this millennium did have between 2008, 2009, the global financial crisis, the COOM, global economic crisis that collapsed growth, especially growth in weaker economies that, in fact, were not responsible for the imprudent behavior that created the crisis. However, they became the worst victims of it. My continent, Africa, was such a victim of it that the period of sustained growth that it had become associated with before the outset of the crisis got shut down and went from an average of 5 to 6% annually to less than 3%. It also created such economic shock to their systems that the macroeconomic stability that they had managed to achieve, which was precedent to the growth path that we saw on the continent, became precarious. And so the idea that the weak should pay for the irresponsible behavior of advanced economies was one that worried me much at that time as vice president of the World Bank. And I used every opportunity I had to call out the advanced economies that whereas the countries that are normally lectured on the business of good governance and on prudent fiscal policy and macro-prudential approaches in monetary policies are now the ones who are bearing the consequence and cost of that behavior on the part of more advanced economies. What an irony and what a paradox. And so it was with this in mind that I was most unhappy at how the global economic crisis was handled. We simply went back to normal. There was really no conversation that enabled the lessons of that collapse, of that shock to the global economy by the actions of people in advanced economies, in the financial system of advanced economies. There was absolutely little or no consequence for the bad behavior that happened. And so irresponsible behavior, reckless behavior on the part of the rich and the powerful has become a part of the current multilateral order under which countries are supposed to grow and develop. It worsens their possibilities. It dims their prospects of such growth and development. The rider to that is that by not focusing on the challenges that came to fore following the global economic crisis, but simply going back exactly to doing things the way we were doing, we missed a big opportunity to scrutinize the global cooperation and collaboration systems. The next set of points for me come out of the fact that the recovery process that then followed was a recovery process that accentuated existing divides and inequalities between advanced economies and economies, low-income countries. Therefore, what we often had was rhetorics of the need to reduce inequality, while the political actions, political leadership necessary for reducing inequality went in the opposite direction. If you doubt what I am saying, all you need to do is to look at the Pandora Papers. The latest Pandora Papers show us clearly the hypocrisy of advanced economies. And that is something that a new multilateral order must find a systemic way to make impossible. It is not a time for moral lecture. It is simply a time to use the moral lessons of what we see emerging out of the Pandora paper leakage to organize the system in a way that does not enable the global elite to continue to behave irresponsibly without any consequences while the poor become poorer. My next set of points on this is that as of 2019, when the World Economic Forum did a mapping and an ordering of the risks, the global risks for the coming year, health pandemic did not make any of the top 10 risks. Was not there. Nobody saw it coming. All other forms of risks and things like extreme weather conditions, failure of climate change, mitigation and adaptation, natural disasters, data fraud or theft, cyber attacks, and terrorism made the top list, but nothing about health pandemic made that list. We all woke up to realizing that even if we had no knowledge of a tiny little community in China, it was going to radically change our lives and our world. And so what the global pandemic was saying to us is that the farthest part of the world is still part of the world, and that we cannot erect any forms of walls against global bads, because global bads will find us if we don't have the systems for preventing them or for resolving them when they appear inevitably. And so my key point here is that because we were not prepared as a global system for dealing with global bads, it was inevitable that the handling, the global management of the pandemic was ineffectual. That is even stating it in a generous way. The point that follows from the pandemic earlier 2 years ago is that the prognosis was that countries in Africa and other regions where health systems are not as advanced as in other economies were going to be worse hit with fatalities. Interestingly, that is not the case. Africa, for reasons that science would yet tell us more, research should help us understand even better how it was that the readiness of the world to pick up dead bodies on all the streets of Africa did not happen. So it wasn't about losing the kind of number of lives that was anticipated for Africa. However, before anyone would get into a sense of triumphalism about that, the impact of the crisis, of the health crisis on Africa has worsened its economic prospects. For Africa, it's not been so much about loss of life as it has been loss of livelihoods. And so the dual impact of the global pandemic, loss of life, loss of livelihoods, that is one on which the world needs to think differently in its collaboration. Because my key point here is that the global pandemic has revealed to us that health is economy and economy is health. Therefore, it is important that the global systems for managing our global health cooperation and collaboration be innovated upon and be reformed in a rigorous and vigorous manner where no country is weak to contain epidemics. We need systems that enable national systems to contain epidemics so they don't grow, they don't morph into global pandemics in the way that happened. What does that require first? It requires absolute transparency, because one person living in an opaque society can be injurious to the rest of us, no matter the nature of our global, no matter the nature of our political systems. And so a minimum standard has to be that on the matter of life, there must be absolute transparency. The matter of health, there must be absolute transparency. A system for ensuring that when it comes to the emergence of epidemics, of contagious diseases, can at least be one simple minimum standard that a new multilateral order must agree and establish for itself. My next set of points is that in a conversation around recovering together, I want to depart from the usual approach where we simply want to talk about sit at the table, making sure that global governance brings in voices that are currently not at the table, reforming global institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, the WTO, the IMF, and the rest of them. Beyond that, I think that something is fundamentally broken about our existing multilateral order. It is no longer fit for purpose. When at the end of the World War II, we emerged the United Nations, today's United Nations is absolutely ineffectual in the conversation, the hard truths that need to be part of every discussion when world leaders gather, when citizens of the world gather, when businesses of the world gather. Hard truths are not being spoken. Hard truths need to be spoken. The system as configured today simply is a whole business of diplomatics and legalese that lead to no concrete outcomes that matter to citizens at home. So it means that our multilateral order needs a complete redesign. The reason that this redesign is important is that same approach will not make any radical transformation of the problems that we are faced with. In order for us to sensibly manage the challenges of climate change, to deal with emerging issues of disruptive technologies and the governance of the Internet of Things and all the other blockchains and what do you call it? Simulation science, the big data, and all the things that have to do with the algorithms and what invasive nature they have and the prospects that we need more than machines. It is even now much more that we need human beings who are really human beings to govern our space that is a natural prolongation between one boundary and the other boundary in a seamless manner. Because we need that, we do need to redesign a multilateral order that supports an efficient and effective outcome. So if we should imagine this new multilateral order, what would we have to reflect on? Well, we would have to reflect on the fact that right at the moment, the world is caught between two nations in their great power competition that is unhelpful to the rest of us. The great power competition, a reenactment of what we saw during the Cold War crisis of the US and the USSR, the Soviet Russia, has re-emerged in a new one between the US and China. These two countries want our world to choose between the two of them. What I propose is a world that refuses to choose between the US and or China. I propose a world where Europe stops being timid. I propose a world where Europe recognizes that its greatest collaborator has to be the same continent it has treated with paternalism. That is the continent of Africa. Africa holds the key to empowering an effort by Europe and the rest of the world toward calling to the table the powers that think they should dominate the rest. In order for a new multilateral system to be designed, it has to be based on sets of values, values that are shared on the basis of mutuality of interest. Mutuality of interest, recognizing that countries and their citizens anywhere on the face of the earth have equal rights to opportunities and to the prosperity that is possible through those opportunities is central to a new way of recovering together. We cannot recover together without a shared vision of the world we want to see going forward. We cannot have that vision except we can agree on a common set of shared values, which today no longer are obvious. Now, if the leaders of countries, as intelligent as they are, have not figured that this is necessary, how then can we get this? Well, it is the reason that the ICRRA and other such organizations exist, because they exist to bring the voices of citizens into the conversation on global norms and global happenings, which is why I congratulate you and the British Council for organizing this event, because it is absolutely necessary that we should begin to imagine a world where citizens are much more active than they were until recently. Why do I say this? I say this because in my research on fixed politics, I came to the conclusion that politics trumps everything in the world, whether at the national level or at the international level, it is all about politics. And so, to the extent that citizens stopped paying attention to national politics, to that extent did national politics become privatized. The privatization of national politics by a very small segment of society has been injurious to the basic principles, practices, and values of democracy. If therefore democracy is under threat, and all you need to do is to read this year's report of the Economist on the state of democracies around the world, in order to see that democracy quotient is on the decline. That decline is traceable especially to the lack of involvement, the lack of informed, not just involvement, but informed engagement of citizens in the process of the management of their public sphere, of the political space. And therefore, by abandoning responsibility, contrary to what I think it must have been Jefferson who said that the price that citizens pay for liberty is unwavering, focus. So anytime citizens are not focused and involved and engaged, democracy will go wrong. And so we see democracy careening off control, becoming a privatized activity of what I call the global elite, who are all connected in one form or the other, as shown clearly by the Pandora paper leaks coming after the Panama leaks also. I therefore suggest that we must design mechanisms that would make citizens work together in a more structured way. It is not enough to say that we have the ECOSOC at the United Nations and that citizens have a platform to talk. That has become a talk fest. I think that we need citizens' engagement that would lead to real action, so that would create a reason for the political class across countries to act in this redesign of the multilateral order. It would start at the national level. It would start at the local level. The reason I say it will start at the national level, because that's the local level, is that most of the weak economies are also economies where political institutions are fragile, very weak. These are the ones where, as citizens of the world, we need to find a mechanism for supporting citizens' emergence as credible voices of change. I think that the worst thing that has happened in development assistance is to keep everything about citizens' empowerment, citizens' political literacy as a tiny little dot amongst bigger issues that are often discussed. Nobody can save a nation better than the citizens of a nation. And therefore, when we gather like this at a global level that this event portends, what we need to ask the researchers to pay more attention to is, how do we use the powers of disruptive technologies to facilitate in an exponential way the emergence of active citizens who can hold their political systems to new levels of accountability and place the demand for the kind of world that we want to see in our multilateral system, in our envisaged multilateral system. The second thing that I propose is that the agenda, where we normally speak of the world as though it were in the future, needs to move from the future of democracy, the future of capitalism, the future of global governance, the future of this, and to now have an incredible sense of urgency that says that the future is now. There is a sense of urgency. So the future of the future is now. The future of globalization, the future of multilateralism, of democracy, of capitalism, the future of works, the future of trade, the future of the SDGs, the future of managing global risk is now. We don't have time to waste. I think that the greatest tragedy of our current multilateral system is the sense of complacency that year follows year without there being concrete results from various global meetings, and yet political leaders are comfortable. We need to have citizens who no longer make it comfortable for global leaders to not deliver results out of global gatherings. Tell me when I have just 5 minutes left. Can you tell me? Please tell me when what?
I think we still have time until, I think, if I'm not wrong, 20 minutes.
I have 20 minutes left.
Yeah.
I have 20 minutes left. Powerful. That's wonderful. That's about the time that I need. So the matter of a sense of urgency in building this new system for our recovering together is proposed, because I do not believe that tentativeness can be helpful. I believe in the sense of urgency where all the deficits that we currently have in the way that the world is organized can be done in an integrated form. The silo approach that the multilateral order has entrenched does not help collaboration and cooperation. That is why the proposal for us to have a system that helps us empower the active engagement of citizens of political systems that are weaker in order to come to the place where the citizens of the world can then have a basis for pushing for a system that is designed with them fully at the table. Not one delegated to the leaders anymore, but one where the color of citizens will be fully reflected at the table with political leaders to design the world that would follow after our as part of post-COVID world. Why do I say this? I say this because it was Albert Einstein that said that imagination is better than intelligence. It's far superior. So imagining the world that would do well for all is one that requires the creativity of as many of citizens who don't get to be called presidents or be given formal offices to be at the table. If you doubt that, imagine what happens in economies where the power of creativity of women and young people are unleashed. Every time we have looked at economic data, societies that finally turn around and include women and include young people in the design of policy solutions have often posed higher levels of growth. Think of a country like Rwanda in Nigeria. It leads the world now in terms of women representation in political office. and in public governance. So I propose an engagement of citizens in the emerging of a new multilateral order on the basis that if citizens are at the center of this design, it will be less exclusionary than what we currently have the formal systems offering to us. Another point that I wish to make is that even while we look to this redesign of the multilateral order, we do have problems that are immediate and need to be tackled. And one problem that I believe needs to be tackled is we need to agree in some way to get science back to a place of credibility. Science is suffering from credibility crisis. We've seen it in the battle against climate change, and we've seen the worst form of it in the battle against the global pandemic. Whatever it was that devalued science and turned it into a matter of political punditry needs to be tackled. It needs to be resolved in every means possible. And I believe that citizens have a role here, because to the extent that we can no longer trust our scientific community in what they say to us as people of the world, to that extent, are we putting ourselves up for great damage, great injury? This needs to be averted as urgently as possible. And it is a good thing that the research community, forgive me, I don't know why I'm sweating in Yale. This community, the science community, the scientific community, is a community that is often not as politically astute as you would expect. It's not in their code, in their DNA, to be politically astute. But that then is an opportunity, because it means that it gives room for collaboration and cooperation. How do we build an inclusive gathering of citizens from around the world that would support the scientific community to gain back its lost glory, its lost credibility? We need the scientific community to be trustworthy again. We need them to be preserved against the onslaught of the political, transactional politics that is costing them a lot of their credibility. The next set of points that I'd like to bring to the table is that the legitimacy and the credibility of even citizens group is a problem. For us to be a credible voice, there has to be credibility and legitimacy. So we also must look inward at the citizens group and at organizations that frame the issues that matter to citizens. What is the definition of citizen when we look at those advocacies? Civil society cannot be civil society of the Western world. It has to be civil society that first practices what it seeks to preach to the political systems, because you cannot have a hijack of the conversation around the importance of citizen-centric multilateral order being driven and shaped by the ones with advantage? How do we bridge the asymmetry that currently exists between civil society in advanced economies and civil society in weaker, more vulnerable societies? It is definitely a matter worth worrying and planning for. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that in reestablishing our global norms and values following what we have been through, we do need to think very radically of the broken state of capitalism. Capitalism is important. Capitalism is the market system that has in fact delivered the most benefit to the most people in the centuries that we have been through. Capitalism, no doubt, stands up well above all the other economic systems that we have seen. And yet, we now know that the underbelly of capitalism is one that must be addressed. To that extent, therefore, I believe that any redesign of the multilateral order would have to begin also with citizens learning how to cooperate and collaborate with business. Business sector has to learn how to respect the voice of citizens. There is antipathy from those two segments in every society. What do we know in terms of options and possibilities that would support the bridging of the gap and the suspicions that exist between civil society and business? Business is important. Business creates wealth. But as we see, the businesses also create shadowy economies that entrench inequality. Before we can even imagine a new multilateral order, in order to quicken the pace at which a final design is placed on the table, I would suggest that at local levels, at national levels, there would be the need for civil society and business groups to commence conversations on how to improve capitalism. Not, in fact, improve capitalism, but to reimagine capitalism. How do we get all the benefits of capitalism and minimize the disadvantages, the problems, the issues that it throws up, especially the leaving behind of too many? The next point that I make as an attachment to the conversation around what variant of capitalism should we begin to embrace as we fix the broken state of capitalism is that coordinated global action was what was envisaged in the articulation of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. These 17 of those goals are far from being on track for achievement by 2030. And the reason is simple. It is easy for politicians, political leaders to gather and make empty, vacuous statements that are not backed by mandates. Why? Because they really do not feel the impact of this lack of progress. It is important that we should reimagine the SDGs and the timeline that we have put for achieving them as part of the kind of growth that we plan for following COVID-19. Trillions of dollars. I think at last count, I believe that even for the continent of Africa, as much as $4 trillion required for annual investment in order to meet with these goals. This money cannot come in the current pattern of fiscal policies. We need to reimagine the kind of fiscal policy that would address the huge and monumental needs for public goods that improve productivity in low-income countries. There is need for a major push, a big deal, a new deal for the world's poor on the basis of finding the resources to address the absence, the deficit in public goods that are required to improve productivity of people so that they can participate in economic activities. We have seen in the course of this millennium that by focusing on human development and improving opportunities by removing barriers that stand in the way of citizens, citizens can in fact lift themselves out of poverty. We know a lot in terms of what research has shown to us. Evidences abound. It is the lack of political will to making innovative approaches the order of the day that could be holding us back. And so, concerning the SDGs, we need to put the IMF with current conversation around the special drawing rights on the table. It needs to be at the center of the conversation. What is it about the IBRD days following the end of the European wars, the world wars, when the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development enabled the reconstruction of Europe? What is it that we can learn from that? Because in this season, we have absolutely no reason to continue to have 700 million people trapped in pernicious poverty, with many more likely to fall into such poverty if nothing transformatively is done to improve productivity of the individual person and remove barriers that stand in their way. It is important because, as we see, poor economic opportunities create the fertile grounds for the kinds of insecurity that is growing around our world. We have to understand that human security is in fact a better option than the mere technology and military security that so much trillions are invested into, especially in the advanced world. How do we then ensure that the concept of human security, where poverty is indeed made the enemy of all, is what comes at the top of the global agenda for the recovery phase of our post-COVID era? Shared economic growth as against poor quality growth that serves the need of a few is urgent for us. What that means is that diversification of opportunities of economies would be at the heart of domestic policy. But domestic policy is not sufficient to address the lopsidedness of today's trade arrangements. And so trade arrangements, everything that is stagnant and not moving forward at the WTO would need to get an ascendancy in priority for the people of the world. Because trade, as arcane as it is, ultimately is about the people. People trade with people. And if we do not rearrange the global norms around trade to support the value given to the productivity of people, no matter where they reside, we then are excluding people through an important process, which is the process of trade, known to drive economic growth in other societies, as our evidence have proven. To that extent, therefore, I imagine a world that looks at boundless trade as a public good, as a global public good. If boundless trade would be a global public good, we must resolve the lack of progress at the WTO. We must remove the shackles to trade that currently exist, that enable advanced economies to dominate the world of trade. Africa, at less than 10% of global trade, is way behind the curve. It is important that we should consider the lessons of COVID-19. Imagine waking up to find that the world was struggling to get access to basic health materials, whether they be PPEs or they be the masks and all other tradables that were needed for the safety of every one of us. We began to wait for one single source because the world went to sleep and decided that monopolized production systems are good enough for us, for as long as businesses can talk of low wages and therefore higher profitability. I think that we have been woken up to the need for decentralizing production systems. In the decentralization of production systems around our world, which would require very vigorous structural reforms of economies, there has to be an incentive for that. And the incentive needs to be a willingness on the part of intransigent countries to the matters that have been put forward at the WTO to resolve issues of IPs, to resolve issues of fisheries, to resolve issues of agriculture and subsidies that go with it, to resolve all issues that matter to the growth and expansion of our global trade. I believe that our world can transit. Our world can transit on the basis of citizens who step up and step out to take responsibility. Taking responsibility turns out not to be something that politicians do well anymore. Our world suffers from a major political leadership deficit. You sometimes have to look around and ask, where are our leaders? If we are lacking leaders in formal systems, it means that we need to think of how leadership emerges informally. That is why it is important for us to not allow the middle class across the nations of our world to continue to live in a selfishness approach to the issues that matter to all. The middle class, whether in Europe or even in Africa, have a tendency to be contemptuous of politics. I used to be like that until just 2 years ago, when I decided that politics is too serious a problem for us to leave it in the hands of the politicians. Our middle class have become lethargic, indifferent, and totally disdainful of the public space. And yet, we must refresh the public sphere with a new set of values and a new set of competencies so that politics does not go to the lowest common denominator across countries of the world. Politics needs to be reinvented. Politicians that we have today, many of them have been part of the existing order where lack of accountability to citizens is unacceptable now. But the citizens have come of age because the democracy that we seek to redesign, the multilateral order that we seek to redesign, the new economic system of a better and improved capitalist mechanism, inclusive, one that drives toward inclusive prosperity, is going to need a different mindset of political leadership. It would need political leadership that realizes that public accountability is the cornerstone of progressive societies. And so I recommend that as part of our takeaway from this year's gathering, that many more citizens who are standing on the margins and sometimes engaging, but oftentimes ignoring what goes on in the public sphere, must be mobilized and given the kind of education, political literacy, leadership training that would enable us create a new supply pipeline of the kinds of political leaders that would take us through the rest of the 21st century. It is consistent with this that I decided together with other colleagues to establish what we know as the School of Politics, Policy, and Governance. And this school has started its operation first in Nigeria, but by next year, we go to 6 other African countries and establish School of Politics, Policy, and Governance. We are training citizens who will be the leaders of a democracy that works in principle and in practice the way it was originally conceived. Democracy that benefits the people because it works for the people, because it is of the people. Our SPPG model is one that uses analytical and empirical evidence as a basis for designing unconventional curriculum that puts issues of shared values, collaboration, and cooperation at the center of the way that political leaders think of problems and solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, in the last few minutes of my keynote, I do want to state that I have now seen, based on evidence, through literature on issues of development, different literature that I have read on different matters, I've come to the conclusion that our 21st century will not be doomed. As a matter of fact, the prospects are going to be better because the inflection point is already with us. This state is unsustainable. Therefore, a new state is eager to emerge. The emergence of this new state will be powered by a troika of things that are very dear to my heart. There are three things that will define and shape, at least for my continent, great possibilities, incredible promise. Women, young people, and technology. These three will drive us in the direction where we would realize that all that the world has so far accomplished is nothing to compare with what is ahead. And that is because in all the data that I have seen around what it means to include women, what it means to include young people, and what the power of disruptive technology can do for us, provided we can find the global mechanisms to govern it appropriately, it is nothing but prospective. It is something that makes me optimistic. Our global good is actually more than our global bad. Unfortunately, our global bad, while less, has more lethal effect and possibility to mar the emergence of our global good. And that is why at gatherings like this, we must take away that sense of fierce urgency to ensure that research and action can meet as often as possible. Not annually at events like this, but in daily hubs where innovation and creativity of all citizens can be centered into solutions that come to the global agenda setting. I want to thank you for the opportunity to address you this year, and I look forward to the rest of the conference as well as to our interaction. I hope I have not abused your time at all. Thank you very much.
Absolutely not, Oby. Thank you very, very much for that. I'm sure, like the rest of us, I'm sort of reeling from the amount of content and thought you've put into that. I would say, just to start, a really welcome sense of passion there as well, which some of us will know we don't always necessarily see at a conference. And I think it was interesting to hear you say quite early on that, you know, there was no time for taking of moral stances, but I think there was a very strong sense of morality actually running through what you said there, in terms of really naming the hypocrisy that exists from many of the major economies and powers in the world, the lethargy potentially of some citizens, perhaps the middle classes, in taking for granted their national politics and allowing them to be privatized, and for not retaining that sense of urgency that is needed to ensure that democracy can flourish. So I think for all of that, that's welcome, that sense of urgency, and that's that genuine call to action and the necessity for research and practice to come together, not just in conferences like these, but on a daily basis. There's a lot there. I think I'm looking forward to hearing from some of our colleagues and friends here from across the ICRRA network. I mean, I'm interested to hear you say that you're optimistic. I'm gladdened to hear you say that you're optimistic and you believe that the world can transition, and you very much ended on a note of optimism. And I also welcome, I think, that the shout out there to young people and to women. Certainly with young people, our British Council Research and Next Generation says time and time again, wherever we talk to them in the world, young people are crying out to be engaged, to be involved, and to have their voices heard, but not just their voices, to actually make a change, make a difference. And what they are most frustrated by is those lethargic systems and those lethargic institutions that do not choose to change, but wait for young people to move towards them. And that is genuinely a source of frustration. I suppose if I might use my chair's privilege to ask you a question to start with. And I would also encourage everyone here, if you have a question, either to write it into the comments box or just raise your hand. I think we'd all like to hear your voices. You're probably fairly sick of mine. Inequality, I think, in the way you've articulated, it seems to be baked into the current system and the current multilateral system. So after the great economic shock earlier this century, things changed. Things did not change. The system essentially reasserted itself. So I'm wondering why you are optimistic now that now there is a space for change. What you think the impetus is for that, for vested interests to make that difference, and where you think those levers of power are now, and have they shifted maybe from 2008?
So that's a very that's a great question, because where I come from in terms of my optimism is what I already observe around me. Nowhere do you say that the problems of economic exclusion as in Africa. Nowhere do you see it as in Nigeria, where we currently are regarded, or we were evaluated to be, the world's capital of poverty, because we have the largest number of perniciously poor people. The extreme poverty is highest in our country. I mean, imagine that a country with a population that is, just about 20% of that of India, overtook India in the number of absolutely poor people living in extreme poverty. And yet in the same society, I have been seeing what the restlessness of young people is beginning to create. Young people are taking advantage of what the world is giving to them. And what the minimum that the world has given to them is the knowledge connectivity that is powered by technology. And so I have seen young people in my country engage themselves in readapting their skills. They are finding, but when you talk about the future of work, they understand this, and they have squeezed all opportunities possible through this by readapting their knowledge, readapting their skills, and integrating themselves into the emerging digital economy. I'm also seeing women who are in small-scale informality in terms of businesses, who are connecting to global trade networks because of the power of technology. I am seeing the human talent be so totally irrepressible in searching for opportunities. And so while the governmental systems are doing their best to limit people, people are breaking out of those limitations and finding themselves. And so it makes me wonder how much more we could grow, how much more we could hasten the speed, the pace at which we can achieve what we want, close the gaps faster, if we had governmental systems that could actually live up to their responsibility. After all, the leitmotif of government is precisely to make environment better for a better life for more and more of citizens. When we can achieve this, then you would see that the prospects that already are emerging will exponentially grow.